For more than a century, it was the biggest empire in history. I mean, the absolute top global power. The British Empire wasn't just some political thing. It was a massive, worldwide story of power, control, and culture. And you know what? It completely shaped the world we're all living in today. So, how on earth did it all work?
To really get a sense of the scale here, just look at this number. By 1922, the British Empire ruled over 458 million people. That's a quarter of the entire world's population at the time. A quarter, all spread across more than 13 million square miles. It's just staggering to think about. And yeah, that incredible scale is where this famous saying comes from. And it wasn't just some poetic boast either. It was literally true. The empire's territories were so vast, so spread out across the globe, that the sun was always shining on at least one of them. From the Caribbean to India, all the way to Canada and Australia.
So, the big question is, how do you actually manage an empire of that size? I mean, how do you run a quarter of the world? Well, there was no single answer. It took a really sophisticated, and let's be honest, often ruthless machinery of both economic and political control.
A huge piece of that machinery was all about money. Take the Navigation Acts, for example. These laws basically locked the colonies into an exclusive trade relationship with Britain. All their exports had to be shipped on English boats, and their imports, they had to come through Britain first. Essentially, the colonies became a source for raw materials and a captive market for British goods. It was a system designed for maximum profit. But, as we'll see, it also planted the seeds of rebellion.
Now, on the political side, the empire kind of had two different faces. For the self-governing dominions, places with majority white settlers like Canada and Australia, they were given a lot of freedom. The idea was to keep them loyal. But in places like India and all across Africa, the strategy was completely different. It was called indirect rule. This meant governing through local rulers, often by playing on existing tensions, a policy of divide and rule that left behind some deep social wounds that, you could argue, are still around today.
Of course, when you build an empire on control, you're bound to get challenges. And this control, it wasn't just passively accepted. No way. Resistance was a constant, and pretty soon, cracks in that imperial foundation started showing up all over the globe.
And this became the rallying point for one of the empire's biggest headaches. The American colonists were getting more and more frustrated with those economic policies we talked about, the ones designed to benefit Britain, like the Stamp Act, which was the first direct tax from Parliament. Their argument was simple but powerful. You can't tax us if we don't have a voice in your government. This one idea, it would light the fuse for a revolution.
And the American Rebellion? It wasn't a one-off thing. It was actually part of a pattern. So in 1765, you see the American colonies unite for the first time to protest taxes. Just 10 years later, it's a full-blown war. Then, you fast forward to 1857, and the Sepoy Revolt explodes in India. This was a massive uprising, sparked by mutinying soldiers, that many considered to be India's first war of independence. From continent to continent, this kind of opposition was just constant pressure on the whole imperial structure.
But, the story of empire isn't just about battles and laws. As those foundations started to crack and the big moral questions got louder, writers and artists were trying to make sense of it all. And this turmoil, it created some of the most powerful literature of the age, stuff that really captured what it was like to be human inside this giant imperial machine.
Which really leads us to the central question here. How could writers back then even begin to process something so complex and often so brutal? Well, two of the greatest authors of the age took it on, but from profoundly different angles.
So we have two literary giants from that era, and they offer these competing visions. On one side, you've got Joseph Conrad, who was a fierce attacker of the whole imperial idea. And on the other, you have Rudyard Kipling, who's often seen as this controversial interpreter of the imperial experience. Their work gives us two completely different windows into the soul of the empire.
Okay, let's start with Conrad. He was born in Poland, but he became a British citizen and drew a lot from his life at sea. His time commanding a steamboat on the Congo River, it just left him completely disgusted. He called colonialism the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience. Wow. And that experience became the raw material for his masterpiece, Heart of Darkness, a haunting journey into the moral raw at the center of the imperial project, ending with those terrifying famous last words, the horror, the horror. And then there's Rudyard Kipling. He was born in Bombay, British India, so he experienced the empire from the inside out. He was one of the most popular writers of his day, but his legacy is, well, complicated. While some called him a prophet of British imperialism, others, like George Orwell, saw him as an incomparable, if controversial, interpreter of how empire was experienced. You see this in his novel Kim, which gives this incredibly detailed picture of Indian life, culture, and all its religions under British rule.
So after the flags eventually came down and the empire dissolved, what was actually left behind? Turns out, the legacy is twofold. It's a mix of the tangible and the intangible, of things made of ink and things made of stone. So the empire left behind this dual legacy. You can still see the physical stuff, the roads, the railways, the legal systems that many nations inherited and still use. But then there's the cultural legacy, which is maybe even more powerful. And that's the enduring stories from authors like Conrad and Kipling that continue to shape the entire debate over what the imperial experience really truly meant.
Which brings us to a final thought. When we look back at it all, what really has the more lasting impact? Is it the physical things an empire built, like its bridges and railways? Or is it the stories told about it? The stories that shape how we remember its glory, its horrors, and its people for generations and generations to come. Something to think about.